stood at my mailbox on Maple Street, the Texas heat already pressing down on my shoulders at 8 in the morning. At 70, my hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they still knew the familiar routine of sorting through bills and advertisements. That's when I saw it. A thick, cream colored envelope with elegant gold borders, the kind reserved for wedding invitations or important announcements. My heart fluttered with unexpected joy. Maybe it was an invitation to David and Rachel's anniversary party, or perhaps little Emma's birthday celebration. After losing my husband Thomas 6 months ago, these family gatherings had become my lifeline, the bright spots that made the lonely evenings bearable. I carried the envelope inside, settling into Thomas's old recliner by the window where the morning light was strongest. My reading glasses perched on my nose, I carefully opened the seal, expecting to see cheerful script announcing a family celebration. Instead, my world collapsed. The document before me wasn't an invitation at all. It was a property transfer agreement for my house, the modest two-bedroom home Thomas and I had saved 40 years to buy. And there, at the bottom of the page, was my signature. Except I had never signed this document. I had never even seen it before. My hands began to shake as I read the terms. The house I was sitting in, filled with 40 years of memories, was being transferred to David and Rachel Collins for the sum of $1. $1 for a home worth $180,000. $1 for the place where I'd planned to spend my remaining years. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the forged signature or the fraudulent transfer. It was the handwritten note paper-clipped to the final page, written in Rachel's neat cursive. "It's easier if you just don't fight this. You'll be taken care of." The paper trembled in my grip as the full weight of betrayal crashed over me. My own son, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia, the boy I'd worked double shifts to put through engineering school, the man who'd promised at his father's funeral that I'd never want for anything, had allowed his wife to forge my signature and steal my home. A gust of hot Texas wind rattled the windows, and the document fluttered in my hands like a wounded bird. I sat there in Thomas's chair, surrounded by the photos of David's childhood, the quilts I'd sewn during long winter evenings, the small treasures that made this house our home, and felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't just my heart breaking. It was my faith in family, in love, in the belief that the people you sacrifice everything for will catch you when you fall. I thought about the past 6 months since Thomas's funeral. Rachel's subtle comments about the house being too big for one person. David's awkward silences when I mentioned staying here. The way they'd exchanged glances when I talked about my future plans. All those moments that had made me feel slightly uncomfortable, but which I dismissed as grief playing tricks on my mind. They hadn't been tricks. They'd been warnings. I stood up slowly, my 70-year-old bones protesting, and walked to the kitchen window that overlooked the garden. Thomas and I had planted together. The tomatoes were ripening in neat rows. The roses he'd given me for our anniversary were blooming bright red against the fence, and I could see the corner where we'd buried our old dog Buddy 15 years ago. This wasn't just a house. This was my sanctuary, my history, my identity, and they thought they could take it with a forged signature and a condescending note about being taken care of. Standing there with that fraudulent document in my hands, feeling the morning sun warm my face through the kitchen window, I made a decision that would change everything. They wanted a signature. They were about to discover just how powerful my signature could be when I chose to use it. 45 years ago, I walked into St. Mary's Hospital in Austin, wearing my crisp white nursing uniform, ready to dedicate my life to healing others. I was Margaret Henderson then, 25 years old, with dreams bigger than my small town upbringing. I met Thomas Collins on my third day. He was a carpenter who'd fallen off a roof, charming me with his terrible jokes while I changed his bandages. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, both of us too practical to spend money we didn't have on a fancy wedding. Our dreams were modest but solid: a house with a garden, children to fill it with laughter, and enough savings to weather any storm life might bring. David came along 3 years later, after two heartbreaking miscarriages that had left me wondering if motherhood would ever be mine. When the doctor placed that squirming, red faced baby in my arms, I made a silent vow that this child would never want for anything I could provide. For the next 20 years, I worked the night shift at the hospital so I could be home during the day with David. While other children came home to empty houses, David came home to fresh baked cookies and help with homework. When he struggled with math, I sat at the kitchen table until midnight, working through problems until he understood. When he wanted to join the robotics club, but we couldn't afford the fees, I picked up extra shifts cleaning houses on weekends. Thomas worked construction during the day, and together we lived on maybe 4 hours of sleep, passing each other like ships in the night, but united in our purpose, giving David every opportunity we'd never had. I remember the morning David got his acceptance letter to Texas A&M. I was stirring pancake batter when he burst through the kitchen door, waving the envelope like a victory flag. Thomas scooped him up in a bear hug while I cried happy tears into the mixing bowl. We'd done it. Our boy was going to be an engineer. The tuition nearly broke us. I sold my grandmother's ring, the only piece of jewelry I'd ever owned. Thomas took on weekend demolition jobs that left his hands raw and bleeding. We ate beans and rice for months, but every penny went toward David's education. I'll never forget the pride in Thomas's eyes at graduation when David walked across that stage. David met Rachel during his senior year. She was beautiful, ambitious, studying business with plans to climb corporate ladders. I tried to like her. I really did. But there was something cold in the way she calculated everything: how much money David would make, what kind of house they'd live in, how his family fit into her vision of success. At their wedding, Rachel insisted on an expensive venue we couldn't afford. "Don't worry about it," David said when I fretted about the cost. "Rachel's parents will cover it." But somehow, the final bill still landed on our kitchen table. Thomas took out a second mortgage on our house to pay for our son's wedding. When Emma was born, I thought Rachel might soften. But when I offered to help with the baby, she bristled. "We can afford a nanny, Margaret." Professional care. My own granddaughter was raised by strangers, while I, a registered nurse with 40 years of experience caring for children, was deemed unfit to help. After Thomas's heart attack last year, everything changed. During his final days in the hospital, David held my hand and promised I'd never be alone. "This house is your home forever, Mom. Rachel and I will make sure you're taken care of." Those words had been my comfort during the long, empty months of grief. Now, holding this forged document, I realized that David's definition of taken care of was very different from mine. They saw an aging widow to be managed, not a mother to be honored. The phone call came 3 days after I'd hidden the fraudulent document in my bedroom drawer, unsure what to do with the evidence of my son's betrayal. It was Rachel, her voice honey sweet with artificial concern. Margaret, darling, David and I have been talking. We're worried about you rattling around in that big house all alone. What if you fell? What if something happened and no one found you for days? I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. I'm managing just fine, Rachel. Oh, I'm sure you think you are. But David and I have found the most wonderful assisted living community. Sunset Manor has all the amenities: meal service, housekeeping, even a bridge club. You'd love it there. Sunset Manor. I knew that place. It was where Mrs. Patterson from down the street had gone before she died, complaining bitterly about thin mattresses and watery soup. The cheapest facility in the county, where families dumped elderly relatives they couldn't be bothered to care for. I'm not ready for assisted living, I said firmly. Well, of course you don't think you are. Denial is common at your age, but David and I are your family, and we know what's best. At my age, as if turning 70 had flipped some switch that made me incompetent overnight. I appreciate your concern, but I'm staying in my home. There was a pause, and when Rachel spoke again, the sweetness in her voice had curdled. Margaret, we need to discuss this in person. David and I are coming over for dinner tomorrow night. Please have something ready. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. In 40 years of cooking for my family, no one had ever demanded I prepare dinner, as if I were a servant in my own home. The next evening, I made David's favorite, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans from my garden. I set the table with my good china, the wedding set Thomas and I had received 45 years ago, hoping somehow that the familiar ritual might bring back the son I thought I knew. David arrived first, kissing my cheek with the same distracted affection he might show a family pet. Rachel swept in behind him, her designer heels clicking against my hardwood floors as she surveyed my kitchen with barely concealed disdain. This house really is quite outdated, isn't it? She said, running a manicured finger along my counter. These appliances must be 30 years old. They work perfectly fine, I replied, carrying the roast to the table. During dinner, Rachel dominated the conversation, talking about their upcoming vacation to Europe and the new car they were considering. David nodded along, avoiding my eyes. When I mentioned the roses blooming beautifully this year, Rachel interrupted. Gardens are so much work for someone your age, Margaret. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone else handle all that maintenance? After I served dessert, David's favorite apple pie, Rachel set down her fork and fixed me with what I suppose she thought was a compassionate look. Margaret, we've made some decisions about your future. Not suggestions, not options, decisions. This house is far too much responsibility for you now. David and I have arranged for you to move to Sunset Manor next month. They have an opening in their memory care unit. Memory care? I nearly choked on my coffee. There's nothing wrong with my memory. Oh, we know you think that. But forgetting to pay bills, leaving the stove on, getting confused about dates, these are all signs, Margaret. David's noticed them too. I turned to my son, searching his face for some sign of the boy I'd raised. David, what is she talking about? I've never forgotten to pay bills or left the stove on. He squirmed in his chair, still refusing to meet my eyes. Mom, you did seem confused at Dad's funeral, And last week, when I called, you couldn't remember what day it was. I was grieving at your father's funeral. And last week, I had the flu. I was medicated and exhausted. See? Rachel said triumphantly. More signs of cognitive decline. This is exactly why you need professional care. I felt the walls of my world closing in. They were painting me as incompetent, building a case for why I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. And suddenly, the forged signature on that property transfer made perfect sense. If they could convince everyone I was losing my mind, who would believe my protests about the house being stolen? I'm not moving to any facility, I said quietly. Rachel's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. I'm afraid it's not really your choice anymore, Margaret. David has power of attorney. The paperwork has already been filed. The room went silent except for the ticking of Thomas's grandfather clock in the hallway. David stared at his plate while Rachel smiled that predatory smile. Of course, if you cooperate, we'll make sure you're comfortable. If you fight us, she shrugged elegantly. Well, things could become much more difficult for you. I looked at my son, at the man I'd sacrificed everything to raise, and saw a stranger. The boy who used to bring me dandelions and called them flowers for the prettiest mama in the world had been replaced by a weak man who'd sold his mother's freedom for his wife's approval. But I wasn't the helpless old woman they thought I was, and I was about to prove it. The transformation of my life began the very next morning. I woke to find David's truck in my driveway and the sound of voices in my living room. When I emerged from my bedroom in my robe, I found Rachel directing two men as they wrapped my television in moving blankets. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Good morning, Margaret," Rachel said without looking at me. "We're just removing some of the more valuable items for safekeeping. You won't need them at Sunset Manor anyway. You can't just take my things." One of the movers paused, looking uncomfortable, but Rachel waved him on. "It's fine. She's moving to assisted living. Family decision." I watched helplessly as they carried out Thomas's recliner, the one where he'd spent his last months watching baseball games and holding my hand. Next went the antique hutch that had belonged to my grandmother, filled with china and photographs spanning 70 years. "The power of attorney papers are all in order," Rachel said when I protested. "David is legally responsible for your care now, which includes managing your assets." David stood by the front door, supervising but not participating, his face a mask of misery. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. By afternoon, my house looked like a crime scene. Empty rectangles on the walls showed where family photos had hung. The good furniture was gone, replaced by a rickety card table and folding chairs. Even my medicine cabinet had been cleaned out. "For your safety," Rachel explained. That evening, I called David's cell phone directly. "Mom, I can't talk long. Rachel and I are having dinner with the Hendersons. David, please. You know this isn't right. I raised you better than this." There was a long pause. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom. But Rachel says if I don't do this, she'll leave me. I can't lose my family." "I'm your family too," I said, but the line was already dead. The next week brought fresh humiliations. My credit cards were canceled without notice. I discovered this at the grocery store when my card was declined while buying bread and milk. The pharmacist informed me that my prescriptions had been transferred to Sunset Manor's facility. My car insurance was canceled because I was no longer a valid driver. When I called the bank about my savings account, I was told it had been transferred to a joint account with David as primary holder. 40 years of careful saving. Every penny I'd earned during those brutal night shifts at the hospital was now beyond my reach. But surely I can access my own money, I asked the young banker. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your son submitted documentation showing your condition. For your protection, all transactions now require his approval. My condition. As if being 70 meant being legally incompetent. The worst came during a visit from David's childhood friend, Mark Peterson, and his wife. I'd known Mark since he was 8 years old, had bandaged his scraped knees, and driven him to Little League games when his own mother was working. When they rang the doorbell, I was overjoyed to see friendly faces. But Mark's wife, Jessica, looked around my stripped house with poorly concealed shock. Margaret, are you all right? David mentioned you've been having some difficulties. What kind of difficulties? I asked. Well, the memory issues, the confusion. He said you've been making poor financial decisions. I felt the blood drain from my face. David said that? Mark shifted uncomfortably. He's worried about you, Mrs. Collins. Said you've been giving money to scammers, forgetting to eat, leaving burners on the stove. Every word was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to justify what they were doing to me. I tried to explain, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Why would David lie about his own mother? What possible reason could he have? After they left, I sat in my empty living room and cried for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Not just from sadness, but from rage. They weren't just stealing my house and money. They were stealing my reputation, my relationships, my very identity. That night, I heard a car in my driveway. Through the bedroom window, I watched Rachel let herself in with a key I didn't know she had. She moved through my house like an inspector, checking rooms, opening drawers, taking inventory of what remained. When she reached my bedroom door, I pretended to be asleep, but I could feel her standing there, watching me. Finally, she spoke to someone on her phone. Yes, everything's going according to plan. A few more weeks and we'll have her out. The house should be ours by Christmas. Our house. The house Thomas and I had worked ourselves to exhaustion to buy had filled with 40 years of love and memories, had planned to die in together. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a nurse learns in 40 years of caring for people who can't speak for themselves. They'd underestimated the strength of someone who spent a lifetime fighting for the vulnerable, and they were about to discover that I was far from powerless. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 3 weeks before they planned to move me to Sunset Manor. I was in my kitchen, making coffee with the last of my good beans, when I heard multiple cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I watched David, Rachel, and 2 men in official-looking uniforms approach my front door. My heart hammered as Rachel used her key to let them in without even knocking. "Margaret," David called out, his voice falsely cheerful. "We have some people here to help you." I emerged from the kitchen to find 2 men in white coats standing in my living room. The name tags identified them as staff from Sunset Manor. "Mrs. Collins," the older man said gently. "I'm Dr. Martinez. We're here to conduct a wellness check and help you with your transition to our facility." "I never requested a wellness check," I said, "and I'm not transitioning anywhere." Rachel stepped forward, clutching a manila folder. "Margaret, we've been over this. Dr. Martinez needs to assess your current mental state for the admission paperwork. My mental state is fine. I want all of you to leave my house immediately. Dr. Martinez consulted a clipboard. Mrs. Collins, I understand you've been experiencing some confusion lately. Forgetting to pay bills, leaving appliances on, difficulty managing your medications. Those are lies, I said firmly. My son and his wife are lying to you. The two men exchanged glances. I could see them writing me off as another difficult elderly patient in denial about their condition. Mrs. Collins, the younger technician said, why don't you sit down and we'll just ask you a few simple questions? I don't want to answer questions. I want you out of my house. Rachel opened her folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Dr. Martinez, here's the documentation we discussed. Financial irregularities. Concerning behavior patterns, the incident with the stove fire. What stove fire? I demanded. There was never any stove fire. You see, Rachel said sadly to Dr. Martinez. She doesn't remember. It's getting worse. I felt reality tilting around me. They had created an entire fictional history of my incompetence, complete with documentation that probably looked official to outsiders. Who would believe a 70-year-old woman over an engineer and his business school educated wife? I'd like to call my lawyer, I said. Margaret, David spoke for the first time. You don't have a lawyer. You haven't been thinking clearly about things like that. Then I'd like to call my doctor. Dr. Henderson retired last year, Rachel said smoothly. You've been refusing to see the new physician we arranged. Another sign of the confusion. Dr. Henderson had retired. That much was true. But I'd been perfectly capable of finding my own new doctor, except that required insurance cards they'd taken away and access to money they'd frozen. I was trapped in a web of lies so carefully constructed that every truth I spoke sounded like the rambling of a confused old woman. Mrs. Collins, Dr. Martinez said, I need you to answer a few questions for our assessment. What year is it? 2024. And who is the president? I answered correctly, but I could see the futility. They weren't here to assess my competence. They were here to rubber stamp a decision that had already been made. Margaret, Rachel said, pulling out yet another document. We need you to sign this voluntary admission form. It will make the transition so much easier. I looked at the paper. It was an agreement to enter Sunset Manor's memory care unit voluntarily, acknowledging my cognitive decline and inability to live independently. I'm not signing anything. We were hoping you'd cooperate, Rachel said, her mask finally slipping completely. But we don't actually need your signature. David has full power of attorney. She turned to Dr. Martinez. We'd prefer voluntary admission, but if necessary, we can proceed with involuntary commitment. We have all the required documentation. The room went dead silent. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking, completely oblivious to the fact that my life was being stolen in broad daylight. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the table next to Rachel's folder was another document, partially visible. It was a real estate listing for my house, complete with professional photos and a sale price of $185,000. They weren't just planning to warehouse me in a nursing home. They were planning to sell my house before I was even gone. I thought about Thomas, about the promises we'd made to each other about growing old in this house together. I thought about 40 years of Christmas mornings in the living room, birthday parties in the backyard, quiet evenings on the front porch, watching the seasons change. And I thought about the forged signature on that property transfer, still hidden in my bedroom drawer. You know what? I said quietly, and something in my voice made everyone in the room look at me. I think I will sign something. I walked to my kitchen drawer and pulled out the fraudulent document I'd been hiding for weeks. When I returned to the living room, I spread it out on the card table where everyone could see it. I'll sign this, I said, pointing to the forged property transfer, right after someone explains to Doctor. Martinez here. Why my signature is already on it, even though I've never seen this document before in my life. The color drained from Rachel's face. The silence in my living room was deafening. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, studying the document with growing confusion. His colleague stepped closer, both men now focused on the property transfer with its obviously forged signature. Mrs. Collins, Doctor, Martinez said slowly. When did you sign this? I didn't, I said clearly. That's not my signature, though it's a fairly good forgery. Check the date. It was supposedly signed while I was at my husband's funeral. I think most people would remember signing away their house on the day they buried their spouse. Rachel's face had gone from pale to bright red. Margaret, you're confused. You signed that weeks ago. Don't you remember? David and I were helping you organize your affairs. Stop, I said, my voice cutting through her lies like a blade. Dr. Martinez, you're here to assess my mental competency. Let me demonstrate exactly how competent I am. I walked to my kitchen and returned with a legal pad I'd been keeping hidden for weeks. This is a daily log I've been maintaining since I discovered this document. Every conversation, every incident, every action taken regarding my care, all documented with dates, times, and witnesses when available. I flipped open the pad. October 15th, 2:30 p.m. Rachel Phillips Collins entered my home without permission and removed items valued at approximately $15,000, claiming power of attorney authorization. October 20th, 9:45 a.m. Discovered my credit cards had been canceled without my knowledge or consent. October 22nd, 1:15 p.m. Bank informed me my savings account had been transferred to joint control, requiring David's approval for all transactions. Dr. Martinez was now studying both documents with the attention of someone who realized he'd walked into something far more complex than a routine nursing home admission. The pattern is quite clear, I continued. Isolate the victim, control their finances, destroy their support system, then create a narrative of incompetence to justify the theft. It's called financial elder abuse, Dr. Martinez. I learned about it during my 40 years as a registered nurse. Now wait just a minute, David finally spoke up, his voice shaking. Mom, you're making this sound criminal, I finished. Because it is criminal. Forging someone's signature on a property deed is fraud. Stealing someone's money is theft. Lying to medical professionals to force someone into institutional care is false imprisonment. I turned to address Dr. Martinez directly. Doctor, in your professional opinion, does a woman capable of identifying multiple felonies and documenting them systematically seem like someone who needs memory care? The younger technician was already backing toward the door. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Collins, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Perhaps we should reschedule this assessment until these Other matters are clarified. There's no misunderstanding, I said, and there will be no rescheduling. You gentlemen are free to go. After the two men left, the house fell silent again. David slumped into one of the folding chairs, his head in his hands. Rachel stood frozen by the window, still clutching her folder of lies. David, I said quietly, look at me. When he finally raised his head, I saw my little boy again, scared, ashamed, and desperately sorry. But I also saw the man who had betrayed his own mother for money. I want both of you out of my house in the next 5 minutes, I continued. Leave the key on the table. If you set foot on my property again without my permission, I'll call the police. Mom, please, David started. You lost the right to call me Mom when you forged my signature and tried to steal my house, I said. From now on, you can call me Mrs. Collins. Rachel finally found her voice. You can't prove any of this. It's your word against ours. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Rachel, I spent 40 years working in a hospital. Do you know what hospitals have? Security cameras, banking surveillance, digital timestamps on everything. I may be 70 years old, but I'm not stupid. I picked up my phone. I'm calling my new lawyer now. Yes, I have one. Hired him last week when I started documenting your crimes. You have 4 minutes left to get out of my house. As they gathered their papers and headed for the door, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. They had underestimated the woman who'd worked night shifts to pay for David's education, who'd held dying patients' hands and comforted grieving families, who'd survived 7 decades of life's storms. They thought they were stealing from a helpless old lady. They were about to discover they'd targeted the wrong woman entirely. The morning after I threw David and Rachel out of my house, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of grief and confusion they deliberately cultivated was gone, replaced by the sharp focus I'd once brought to medical emergencies. My first call was to James Morrison, the attorney I'd secretly consulted the week before. A former legal aid lawyer, now in private practice, he specialized in elder abuse cases and had listened to my story with the serious attention it deserved. Margaret, I've been researching your case, he said when I reached him. The good news is that you documented everything beautifully. The bad news is that your son's power of attorney paperwork appears to be legitimate. How is that possible? I never signed those documents. That's what we need to prove. I'm sending an investigator to interview the witnesses listed on the power of attorney documents. In the meantime, we need to protect your remaining assets. Within hours, James had filed emergency motions to freeze all joint accounts and reverse the property transfer. He also arranged for a court-appointed advocate to review my case and assess whether the power of attorney had been obtained through fraud or coercion. My second call was to my bank. Armed with James's documentation, I met with the manager who had processed the account transfers. Mrs. Collins, I apologize, but your son provided medical documentation stating... Medical documentation from whom? I interrupted. I'd like to see every piece of paperwork he submitted. When the manager pulled my file, I discovered that David had submitted a letter allegedly from Dr. Henderson, my retired physician, describing my cognitive decline and recommending financial oversight. The letter was dated 3 months after Dr. Henderson had moved to Florida. This is fraud, I told the manager. Dr. Henderson has been retired for 8 months. I can provide his contact information if you'd like to verify this. The manager's expression changed from defensive to concerned. Mrs. Collins, if you're suggesting this documentation was falsified, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating it as fact. My son and his wife have committed multiple felonies to steal my assets. By the end of the week, the bank had initiated its own investigation, and temporary restrictions were placed on all accounts pending resolution. My third action was the most satisfying. I called Sunset Manor and requested a meeting with the administrator. Mrs. Collins, we were expecting your admission next week, the director said, when I arrived at her office. Is there a problem with the arrangements? Yes, there's a problem. I'm not moving here, and I never agreed to move here. Your staff participated in an attempted involuntary commitment based on fraudulent medical documentation. I spread copies of my evidence across her desk. This is the forged property transfer. This is the falsified medical letter. This is my daily log documenting the systematic financial abuse. Your Dr. Martinez was brought to my home under false pretenses to rubber stamp an illegal commitment. The administrator studied the documents with growing alarm. Mrs. Collins, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing. Your staff never interviewed me independently, never verified the medical claims, never asked to see the alleged evidence of my incompetence. You took the word of people who stood to profit from my institutionalization. I leaned back in my chair, feeling more powerful than I had in months. I'm not here to sue you, yet. I'm here to warn you that this case is now under investigation by the district attorney's office. Any records you have regarding my case should be preserved as evidence. The most difficult call was to my old supervisor at St. Mary's Hospital. Linda Martinez had been a colleague for 30 years and a friend for longer. Margaret, honey, I heard about your troubles, she said when I reached her. David called here asking about your employment records, said he needed them for your nursing home application. My blood ran cold. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. Personnel records are confidential. But Margaret, he seemed to think you'd been having memory problems. He mentioned incidents at work. Linda, there were never any incidents at work. My employment record is spotless. You know that. David is lying to build a case for my incompetence. There was a long pause. Oh, honey, what has he done? When I explained the situation, Linda was furious. That boy ought to be ashamed of himself. Margaret, if you need character witnesses, every doctor and nurse who ever worked with you will testify to your competence. By the end of my first week of fighting back, I had frozen all my assets and initiated fraud investigations, hired a reputable attorney with elder abuse expertise, documented every falsified claim and fraudulent document, secured character witnesses from my former colleagues, filed complaints with Adult Protective Services, contacted the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges. But the most important thing I'd done was remember who I was. Not the confused, helpless victim they'd tried to create, but Margaret Collins, the woman who'd saved lives, raised a family, and survived every challenge life had thrown at her. They'd picked the wrong target, and they were about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been. 3 months after I'd thrown David and Rachel out of my house, I stood in my kitchen making banana bread for the first time since discovering their betrayal. The morning sun streamed through the windows. I'd finally felt safe enough to leave uncovered, and the familiar rhythm of stirring batter brought a peace I thought I'd lost forever. The legal battles were far from over, but the tide had turned decisively in my favor. James Morrison had been relentless in his investigation, uncovering a paper trail of fraud that even shocked him. The forged medical letter, the falsified power of attorney documents, the manipulated bank records, everything David and Rachel had done, left digital fingerprints that couldn't be erased. They got sloppy, James had explained during our last meeting. Probably thought a 70-year-old widow wouldn't fight back or wouldn't know how to navigate the system. They underestimated your intelligence and your documentation skills. The court had already reversed the property transfer and restored full control of my finances. More importantly, a judge had voided David's power of attorney after determining it had been obtained through fraud and misrepresentation. I was once again the sole owner of my house, my bank accounts, and my future. But the real transformation wasn't legal, it was personal. For the first time in months, I felt truly safe in my own home. I changed the locks, installed a security system, and, most importantly, rebuilt my support network. Linda Martinez and several of my former nursing colleagues had become regular visitors, bringing casseroles and gossip from the hospital. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by every few days to check on me, and I'd started a weekly coffee group with 3 other widows from the neighborhood. I'd also discovered something remarkable. Life after 70 could be an adventure, not a slow slide toward irrelevance. With my finances restored, I'd enrolled in a computer class at the community center. At first, I'd felt foolish sitting among college students learning about social media and online banking. But the instructor, a patient young woman named Maria, helped me navigate this new world with encouraging enthusiasm. Mrs. Collins, you're my star student, she'd said just last week. You've mastered email, online banking, and even started that blog about nursing history. You're more tech savvy than half my younger students. The blog had been Maria's suggestion, but it had become my passion. Stories from the Night Shift, a nurse's memoir, was attracting readers from around the world. Former patients, other nurses, people interested in medical history. Writing about my 40-year career reminded me that I had wisdom and experience worth sharing. I'd also started volunteering with the county's Adult Protective Services, helping investigate other cases of elder abuse. My nursing background and recent personal experience made me uniquely qualified to spot the warning signs and support victims who felt powerless against manipulative family members. You have a gift for this, said Carol Henderson, the APS director. Victims trust you because you've been where they are. You understand the shame, the confusion, the feeling that somehow it's your fault. The work was emotionally difficult, but deeply satisfying. Last month, I'd helped an 80-year-old man document how his nephew had been stealing his Social Security checks. The week before, I'd sat with a grandmother whose daughter-in-law was trying to force her into an unnecessary nursing home placement. In each case, I saw myself 6 months ago, frightened, isolated, but not powerless. My relationship with David remained complicated and painful. He'd sent several letters through his attorney, expressing regret and asking for forgiveness. Rachel, predictably, had shown no remorse, instead, hiring her own lawyer and claiming she'd been manipulated by David's obvious mental health issues. I wasn't ready to forgive. I might never be ready, but I'd found something more valuable than reconciliation. I'd found myself again, standing in my kitchen, pulling golden loaves from the oven. I reflected on how different my life looked now. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow, marking time until death. Now I was a blogger, a volunteer advocate, a student, and a survivor. I'd learned that aging didn't mean becoming invisible or irrelevant. It meant choosing how to use the wisdom you'd accumulated and the time you had left. Thomas would have been proud of the woman I'd become in the aftermath of betrayal. Strong, independent, and determined to help others find their own strength. The courthouse steps were slippery with October rain as I descended them for the last time, James Morrison holding an umbrella over my head. Inside, a judge had just sentenced David to 2 years probation and ordered him to pay $47,000 in restitution, the exact amount they'd stolen from my accounts, plus interest and legal fees. Rachel had received a harsher sentence, 18 months in county jail and 5 years probation for fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse. Her business license had been revoked, and she faced civil lawsuits from 3 other families who'd discovered similar patterns of manipulation in her financial consulting practice. "How do you feel?" James asked as we reached his car. I considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, I would have said I felt victorious. 3 months ago, I might have said vindicated. But standing there in the rain, watching my son walk to his car without looking back, I felt something more complex. Free, I finally answered. I feel free. The legal victory was satisfying, but it wasn't what had healed me. That had come through the slow, difficult process of rebuilding my life and my sense of self-worth. It had come through discovering that being 70 didn't mean being powerless, and that family wasn't defined by blood, but by respect and genuine care. David had called the night before the sentencing, his voice broken with what sounded like genuine remorse. "Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that losing you has been the worst punishment of all. Rachel, she made me believe that taking care of you was a burden, that love meant control. I was wrong about everything." I'd listened without interrupting, letting him speak the words I'd needed to hear for months. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I'd told him honestly, "but I can tell you this. If you ever want to be part of my life again, you'll have to earn it. Not with money or grand gestures, but by proving you understand the difference between love and control." How do I do that? Start by getting counseling. Figure out how a man who was raised with love could treat his mother like property. And David, if you ever contact me again, it will be as an equal asking permission, not as a son demanding access. Back home that evening, I sat on my front porch watching the neighborhood settle into twilight. Mrs. Patterson was walking her dog. The young couple across the street was carrying groceries from their car. Normal people living normal lives, just as I was finally able to do again. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria, my computer instructor. "Saw the news about your case. Proud of you. Your latest blog post got 500 comments. People are inspired by your story." I smiled, thinking about the post I'd published that morning. Why I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. It wasn't about revenge or legal victories. It was about the moment I'd realized that my worth didn't depend on my children's approval, that my voice mattered regardless of my age, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's worst behavior. The comments had been overwhelming. Other seniors sharing their own stories of family manipulation, adult children apologizing for taking their parents for granted, professional caregivers thanking me for speaking up about elder abuse. Your story gave me courage to report my own situation, one woman had written. I thought I was crazy, but your post helped me see the pattern. That comment meant more to me than any legal judgment. My suffering had meaning if it helped even one person recognize their own worth. As darkness fell, I went inside and made myself a cup of tea with honey, just as Thomas and I used to do every evening. But instead of sitting in his chair, mourning what I'd lost, I sat at my new desk and opened my laptop. I had more stories to tell, more people to help, more life to live. At 70, I'd learned the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to start over, to stand up for yourself, or to discover who you really are when you stop trying to be who everyone else wants you to be. The scared, confused woman David and Rachel had tried to erase was gone forever. In her place sat Margaret Collins, survivor, advocate, and, finally, truly free. I'm looking directly at you now, the person watching this story unfold. If you've made it this far, maybe something in my experience resonates with you. Maybe you recognize the warning signs in your own family. Or perhaps you see yourself in my story, dismissed, controlled, or made to feel invisible because of your age. Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Your voice matters. Your dignity is not negotiable, and family that truly loves you will never ask you to surrender your basic human rights for their convenience. If you're experiencing financial abuse, manipulation, or threats of unwanted institutionalization, document everything. Write it down, save emails, keep records. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, because it probably is. And remember, asking for help isn't admitting defeat, it's fighting back. To the adult children watching, being responsible for aging parents doesn't mean being in control of them. Love isn't displayed through power, but through respect. Your mother or father raised you, sacrificed for you, and deserves to be treated as the adult they've always been. Financial support doesn't buy you the right to make decisions for someone who's capable of making their own choices. I want you to do something for me. Look in the comments below and share your story. If you've witnessed elder abuse, if you've stood up for yourself or someone else, if you've learned to value your own worth regardless of your age, tell us about it. Let's create a community where dignity has no expiration date. Like this video if you believe that respect is the foundation of real family. Share it if you think someone else needs to hear this message. And subscribe, because every week I'll be here telling more stories of people who refuse to be silenced. Remember, your signature has power when you choose how to use it. Don't let anyone forge your future. Real family doesn't diminish you. It builds a bigger table and saves you a seat. The strongest families are built on respect, not control. And it's never too late to demand the dignity you deserve.